Hey everybody, today I thought I'd make a quick video reviewing the new Rolo Tomassi album, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Astraea? Rolo Tomassi are a mathcore band that have certainly shaped their own sound within the genre and have managed to stand out amongst the mathcore lot. One of the main ways they've done this is the heavy use of synths within their sound. However, unlike most synths used in metal, their synths have a very sort of surreal, dreamy kind of quality to them. Now, despite the fact I actually really enjoy what makes them unique, when they released their debut album, Hysterics, I wasn't actually that big a fan of it. I definitely felt there was a lot of potential there, and they had a lot of talent and great musicianship and things like that. But for me, the songs just weren't quite there. The whole album just felt a little bit disjointed and unstructured to me, and I also felt like certain parts dragged on without doing enough interesting things or changing a great deal. The next album, Cosmology, was definitely a step up and a step in the right direction. It sort of felt like the band was kind of finding their feet a bit more. The synths, instead of like on Hysterics where they felt like they were kind of replacing a lead guitar, they were used differently on Cosmology in the sense that they were used more in the background as opposed to the forefront, and gave it a very sort of creepy atmosphere around the whole album. And like I said, I thought this was actually a massive step up for them. I much preferred how they were using the synths now. The songs were certainly a lot better, but I still felt that it was only good and nothing mind-blowing. But anyway, their new album and third release, Astraea, certainly provides a few new things for the band. First and foremost, they have a new guitarist and a new drummer, and as far as production goes, they're back with Jason, who produced Hysterics. The first song on the album is called Howl, and I feel it really opens things up nicely and really sets a pace for the album. It opens with a really nice background drone and this really kind of creepy synth placed over the top. It's really kind of atmospheric at this point. Behind these two things, there's some really nice subtle instrumentation, mostly from the drums, and he uses great use of his cymbals to really create a nice atmosphere and make sure that it's changing and staying interesting while it's building. And then eventually the vocals kick in and the whole thing just kicks in this really sort of climactic high. However, I must admit, I actually feel that it didn't quite reach the climax that I was hoping for or was expecting. And this is down to the production, because ultimately it doesn't have as much kick as I feel it should, and it kind of feels like the instruments are sort of swallowing each other in this crashing noise, which I feel is unfortunate, because if it was produced slightly better, it would have sounded really, really great and nice, and just really, like I said, climactic and quite theatrical. But anyway, after the intro, it goes back in sort of classic Rolo Tomassi style hardcore aggression. And one thing that's definitely noticeable at this point in the song in particular is that it's a bit more mathy than their previous releases. It seems that they're taking a lot more acid jazz influence on this album, as you'll notice throughout the listen. There's a lot more of the quieter moments that are sort of almost psychedelic and really dreamy. And that's not to say I don't think this is a mathcore record or anything like that. It's certainly got a lot of the technicality that the previous albums had. I just feel like a lot of it is a bit more straightforward than previous releases. The next track, Exaluna Scientia, hope I'm pronouncing that right, it opens up really, really nicely. It has a really fantastic intro section with lots of layers and lots of interesting sounds and textures. One of my favourites is actually the synths that are hanging in the background. It has this really sort of eerie quality, and it really just sounds great at this point in the song. It's a really, really solid intro. I love the chord progression as well. But anyway, around 1 minute 20 in the song, it sort of simmers down and the focus is on the bass. It's playing this really, really nice groove with the drums underneath it playing as well. As this progresses and builds, you hear some nice guitar in the background as well, and there's some really, really nice vocals that just sort of build on it and just add more and more interesting sounds and layers, and it just sounds really, really nice. They clearly showed that they can build up something really well. Just before the end of this build, there's a really nice section where there's just these really nice synths layered over the top of it, and it's actually something I really enjoy across the whole album. They create these very psychedelic, uplifting, dreamy atmospheres with these quieter moments on the album where they're sort of building something, and it just sounds absolutely great. It's almost a slightly uplifting feeling. It's really, really nice. And as the track progresses into the end of the song, it actually sort of keeps this quality with it as everything really kicks in. It still maintains this really dreamy atmosphere, and the vocals are fantastic in this section of the song. You can hear the singing clearly over the top, and there's some screaming underneath it, also layered by Eva, I would imagine. But at this point, it just sounds amazing, kind of trippy, just really, really nice, great layers, great sounds, everything I look for in a Rolo Tomassi song. Now, at this point, I just want to mention the fact that Rolo Tomassi, on this album, create these masterfully atmospheric sections in the song where it's super dreamy, kind of uplifting, and the synthesizers have this really like synthetic feel to them, and I really enjoy it actually. It just creates these amazing builds, and this sort of feel is on almost every track. There's just a really subtle atmosphere at worst, but at best it's just full on acid jazz sections. I think the track that displays this most is definitely the last track, but we'll get to that in a minute because it is a 7-minute epic. Now, as I said earlier on, there are certainly tracks on this album that I feel are a lot more straightforward than previous releases. One of those would be The Scales of Balance. It's, in my opinion, probably the most straightforward track on the album. The intro is very sort of hardcore influenced, but of course keeping to what Rolo Tomassi traditionally do. It still has their sound about it, and it's actually a really nice song. Another track I want to quickly talk about that does something sort of new with Rolo Tomassi's sound is again, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Empiresque. And what this track does is it opens with some piano and bass that evolves into a really nice kind of dreamy soundscape. Again, it's incredibly uplifting, and eventually screams kick in with guitar and drums, and it just builds further and further, and it gets to the point where all of a sudden there's just these really nice hard-hitting syncopated drum hits with guitar chords strung over the top. And even though this is sort of the end of the initial build, they start building on this again as it goes further into the verse. And I love the way they just build on this with more intricate guitars, some synths thrown in over the top, the subtle drone in the background. There's a real nice attention to detail here. Eventually the drums start playing a more solid groove, and in sort of the last minute of this track, after everything sort of built to this really climactic ending, everything starts to get rather noisy with what sounds like the drums playing a blast beat, and it gets really nice and thick. But again, I kind of feel like the production here lets it down, and everything just sort of gets swallowed, and it becomes a little bit too noisy and not clear enough on what's going on. Now, the reason I wanted to speak about that song is because I actually feel like their songwriting overall is getting a hell of a lot better and a lot stronger. Everything's starting to feel more smooth, more like songs as opposed to just disjointed sections. Now, the next track on this album I wanted to speak about quickly as well, because it's kind of an interlude in the album. It's a really nice piano track. Now, it feels like the piano is being played in a really big room, so it's really nice echo and it has a really warm feeling to it, but what's actually being played is incredibly eerie and it has that quality about it, and it creates this really nice atmosphere for an interlude. Another thing I liked about this track is it was only like a minute or something. It's really what an interlude should be on an album. It's a great example of that. It really doesn't outstay its welcome at all. The only criticism for this interlude I have is that I feel it's slightly out of place in terms of where it is, because the next song that kicks in is Eccoprasia. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but whatever. And this track literally just kicks in straight after the piano of the previous track, and it's a really sudden switch with no foreshadowing whatsoever. And they might have done this on purpose, but I'm not such a fan of it. However, the actual track is really one of the more technical tracks on the album. It's got the really sort of spazzy rhythm, like they used to write on Hysterics and Cosmology. I feel this is actually one of the stronger math songs they've written. It's really like each section just flows really smoothly. And another thing that's really demonstrated within this song that kind of applies to a lot of other songs on here is you really notice the guitar has stepped up quite a bit. There's a lot more use of guitar, that it's doing a lot more this time around as opposed to just playing the rhythms underneath synth lines and things like that. The synth and guitar in this album have kind of switched places in a way. For a lot of the sections, the synth is still predominant, but what I'm trying to say is there's a bit more balance in power, which is quite nice to hear. But ultimately, this song is just a really hard-hitting song. It's not too long, and it just sounds absolutely great. Now, the next track and the last song I want to talk about is the very last track on the album actually, and it's called Illuminaire. This track carries on the tradition of ending the album on the longest track, which is what they did with their previous two releases. The intro to this track is just really nice. It's got a very ambient quality to it, this sort of throbbing synth, and there's also this really odd rumbling underneath it that sort of phases in and out. And it just builds this really nice atmosphere. It doesn't outstay its welcome because it doesn't really change that much either. I feel like it was kept short and nice. And eventually the track sort of kicks in quite suddenly, but it maintains the very soundscapey ambience that the intro had, but it's super in your face and monstrous. It sounds just amazing. At this point, it's slightly more stripped down layers wise compared to the rest of the record. I feel like the production of the whole record suits this song more than most of the record. And at this point in the album, it really reminds me of Devil Soldier's Soul. Just this super nice soundscape, super atmospheric, and kind of has an ambient quality about it, like I said before. Then eventually it just simmers down again after about the 3.5 sort of minute mark. It has these hanging synths in the background, but this time the drums are trying to add some variety to the ambience with the bass guitar as well. And as the track goes on, it's built upon in a really nice way, with some nice subtle guitars in the background, with some more layers and textures coming into play. Again, it sounds very dreamy, and at this point it just really sounds super spectacular, to be honest. Eventually, during this build, the drum just sort of cuts out and there's this new synth melody that comes in. I love the sound it makes, I love the texture of the synth as well. It's slightly different to what you've heard on the rest of the album so far. This new texture kind of feels almost glittery in a way. It's kind of hard to describe, it's super colourful. And then the track kicks in again, and at this point it just feels super smooth and psychedelic, but it's really loud, and again maintaining that ambient quality about this entire song. And they just build upon this climax, they're adding more and more layers in, just really nice little melodies and things like that just going on in the background. And at this point the song is just really uplifting and very appealing to the ears. And this just carries on until the end of the track, until everything just sort of cuts out and hangs for a bit, then fades away. This track is a really climactic ending for the album. I don't think it could have ended better. And like I said, I feel like the production suits this track more than most of the album, and therefore it was just twice as effective. As a whole, this song kind of reminds me of a really spectacular fireworks display, with just lots of different colours and different kinds of firework. On the whole, I feel like this album was a lot more straightforward than their previous releases. The songwriting was much more impressive, everything's flowed a lot smoother, and it just felt like they were writing songs and not just random sections that were sort of stapled together. The quieter moments on this album, the acid jazz influence moments on this record sound great like before, with these super psychedelic and sort of trippy sounds to them. One thing I really enjoyed about this album is the amount of attention to detail there is. All the textures and all the layers just sound great together. My main issue, I feel like I've touched down upon quite a bit already, and that is the production. I just feel like there's certain moments in songs where it could sound really climactic and really loud and crashing, but it just doesn't. The production kind of leaves it feeling a bit flat, which is a shame because it killed a few really nice build-ups. Having said that, it does do favours for the quieter registers in this album, especially like I mentioned earlier on in the last half of that last track on the album. And I will say I feel like this is Rolo Tomassi's strongest effort yet. And as a result, I'm going to give this album a 7 out of 10. If you haven't already checked out Rolo Tomassi and you're into your bands like Dillinger Escape Plan, Converge, you know, your standard mathcore bands, definitely give them a check out, but expect something a little more sung, a little more atmospheric than those two bands. But anyway, that's the end of this review, and I'll see you next time. Bye!